All right, good evening, everybody. Good evening. Hi, I'm David Cash. I'm the Dean of the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, and on behalf of Interim Chancellor Catherine Newman, who could not make it this evening. She was unfortunately waylaid. She was excited to be here with you, but could not make it. The University of Massachusetts Boston, the McCormick Graduate School, the Department of Political Science, and the College of Liberal Arts. I want to welcome you all to this important town hall. And Governor Weld and his wife Leslie Marshall, thank you so much for coming today and spending the next couple of hours. I'd also like to thank Professor Erin O'Brien, who you'll be hearing more from later in a discussion with Governor Weld. But I also want to thank a whole team of folks who scrambled together within the last week to put this on. Allie Duffy, thank you so much. In our office, Jack Lee, Rochelle Straker, Sarah Hazlitt, Dennis Lee. I think I've gotten everyone, but especially Bob Turner. Bob Turner was instrumental in making this happen and has been instrumental in making all of these events happen. I also want to really thank the tech crew, who also last minute, John Gesso and his team. You guys are incredible the way you put things together. This is live streamed right now, so thank you very much for everything that you do. We've got the crew here who has helped set up the stage and the chairs and everything. Thank you very much. And public safety. Thank you so much, public safety folks, for securing these kinds of events. As you may know, as we have done now for 3 election cycles, the McCormick School has been convening a series of debates and town halls. They're central to UMass Boston's mission to educate and to pursue and create knowledge, and to do so mindful that we are a public institution that exists to serve citizens and the public good, illuminating significant public issues and choices. It's hard to recall an election cycle that seems more significant and that has as high temperature as this one. All the more reason why civic discourse is important. And here's how the discourse will work today. We'll first hear a short address from Governor Weld. Then I'll invite up Professor O'Brien for a discussion with the governor, followed by a Q&A from the audience. There are microphones on either side, so just when the time comes and Professor O'Brien lets you know, just line up behind the microphones and you can ask your questions there. Now I'd like to welcome and introduce our guest and candidate for the Republican nomination for president, Bill Weld. He's probably best known in his role in this state as the 68th governor of Massachusetts from 1991 to 97, but he has a long and distinguished career as a public servant. He served on the staff of the legal team during the Nixon-Watergate investigation, by the way, with Hillary Clinton as well. He was the U.S. Attorney in Boston in the early 80s, and his last foray in national politics, he ran for vice president on the Libertarian ticket in 2016. Please join me in welcoming Governor Bill Weld. And I think this is on? Yes?
Thank you very much, Dean, and thank you all for coming. It's a privilege for me to be back here at UMass Boston. I'm thrilled to be able to give you a few words about why I'm running and what I hope to do. I've actually thought about running for president twice before, in 1996 and 2000. Elected not to make those races, but looking at what was going on, not right after Mr. Trump was elected, but after 3 years when we saw how he would conduct his office and comport himself in office, my wife, who's my chief speechwriter and main political supporter and advisor, decided that it really was time for someone to plant a flag. So I announced my candidacy last year on April 15th, and we've been at it full time. I took a leave from my law firm and consulting firm to do this. So our heart is absolutely in it, and as the dean indicated, I do feel that the stakes are pretty high. Looking at Washington, and I will just mention that I've hung around at least 3 administrations. I served 7 years for Ronald Reagan, hung around both Bush administrations and the Bill Clinton administration, watching what was going on in the Oval Office and the interplay of presidential action and the formulation of policy and how things hit the ground. So I do feel qualified to start Monday in the job if things should happen in in that direction. And if you don't think you can do the job, you shouldn't be running for it. And I tell people, if you don't have a pretty short priority list of things you want to do in that office, you shouldn't run for office. And I do have a priority list, and I'll just mention those before we start with the professor. But number one, I don't think we need trillion-dollar deficits, and I think that's a generational issue. It's the younger generation that's going to pay the penalty if we keep running those deficits, and they will never see Social Security. They won't see the benefit of the social programs, which a healthy budget can afford to underwrite. So I consider that a generational issue. I also have a lifelong career as an environmentalist. When I was U.S. Attorney, I cleaned up Boston Harbor. When I was governor, I cleaned up the state's rivers. I believe very strongly in clean air and clean water. I think that the possibility that the polar ice cap may melt in the middle years of this century is very real. 2,000 scientists swear that that's true, and they're not mistaken. And there's really no basis for the president to take the position he has, which is that the whole thing is a hoax. And the consequences of allowing the polar ice cap to melt would be all the shorelines in the world would be erased. There would be catastrophic weather, which would beggar anything we've seen to this point. 50 nations would be unable to feed their population. 50 nations, because of flooding and devastation from the catastrophic weather. Every single mountain glacier in the world would melt, and that's the sole source of drinking water for 300 million people, which is only a little less than the population of the United States. So it would be a complete worldwide catastrophic situation. For that reason, if I'm elected president, I will declare a national emergency requiring us to put a price on carbon so that the coal companies and the oil companies and the gas companies and the mining companies will have to pay a fee of $40 to $50 a ton for every ton of carbon that they put into the atmosphere. And at a certain point, that's going to cause them to say, ouch, I don't want to put in any more carbon. And that will mean that the polar ice cap will not melt because the temperature of the Earth's atmosphere will not rise sufficiently between now and the middle of the century. Well within the president's authority, executive authority, to do that. And it's probably the most important thing the next president will do, but this president is ignoring it. One other thing that's going to happen that has wide-ranging ramifications in the next few years is because of artificial intelligence and driverless cars and drones and robotics and machine learning, we are going to lose 15 to 20% of all the jobs that now exist in the United States of America in their present form. So that's something we've got to plan ahead for. As part of my campaign activities, out of sight, I went out to Palo Alto and San Francisco last year, sat at the feet of the leaders of artificial intelligence, and that's the nerve center of AI in this country is those two cities. We're 45 minutes apart, and learned about it. It's going to create enormous wealth because by definition the economy will be made more efficient. And the bad news is we'll lose all those jobs. The good news is because the new economy will have more technology, the wages are going to be higher wage, the jobs are going to be higher wage jobs. So how do we match the displaced workers with the new higher wage jobs? And they told me that it's going to take 3 semesters of post-high school education for someone to qualify for one of the higher paying jobs. I did the arithmetic. It's not trigonometry, it's arithmetic. That would be 1/3 of 1% of the budget in Massachusetts, which is child's play. One thing I can tell you, having been governor for 2 terms, is that to govern is to choose. And you rank priorities, and you absolutely do choose. And the choice here would be very simple, to allocate 1/3 of 1% of the state budget to making sure that all those displaced workers could get those higher wage jobs. And think of these people in a way as natural Trump voters. They're displaced workers. In some sense, the core of the president's support as his campaign developed in 2016. Who's worrying about this? Nobody. Who's taking action here? Nobody, as far as I can tell. And the reason probably is not any one person. It's not Mr. Trump, although he has the responsibility. It's because the parties are so poisonously divided in Washington, D.C., they really don't want to do business with each other. And that's a completely unsatisfactory state of affairs. I mentioned in the other room when I was talking with the students earlier that I've always reached across the aisle. I would have a bipartisan cabinet in Washington, just as I had in Boston. And, I said to the Democrats in the legislature when I came in, let's have, coffee and crackers every Monday afternoon. Have a social meeting, not a legal meeting or a legislative meeting. Just get to know each other better. And we did, and it worked out terrifically. It ushered in a golden era of cooperation between the parties in Massachusetts that persists to this day. Every single succeeding speaker and Senate president and governor has done exactly the same thing. They still meet at the same time, 3:15 on Monday afternoons, which is to give me time to fit in my daily squash game, which they used to love to make fun of me for. But the principle was established, and that's what we need in Washington, D.C. One thing people do know about me is that I've always been comfortable in my own skin. I've always had sort of a bantering relationship with the press, which is not typical in Washington, D.C. People feel affronted and, defensive about things, and there's no need to feel defensive, which is why I never go off the record. And I think I could change the atmosphere in Washington on day one, bringing that spirit to the Capitol. So thank you very much. That's all I got to say about myself, and I welcome the professor to the stage.
Now, while the governor and Professor O'Brien take a seat, let me introduce her. Professor O'Brien is one of those rare scholars who's just as comfortable in front of a radio microphone or TV camera as she is in publishing academic articles in the most prestigious journals or books and book chapters. Her research and teaching interests focus on the politics of poverty and social welfare policy, voting access in the United States, and gender in political participation and representation. She's widely heard and seen on Boston's radio and TV political shows, but her work has also been covered in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Dallas Morning News, Miami Times, NPR, MSNBC, and many, many other outlets. Please join me in welcoming Professor O'Brien.
Well, when the governor walked in, I said, I am pumped. And it's great to see a bunch of students here, some from my class. And as I said to your wife when you came in, a lot of the students here took the day off or the afternoon off to come see this. So it means a lot at any university when a candidate comes, but in particular, it means more at UMass Boston. So I have some questions for you. My first question for you is about the role of political parties. I'm struck over the course of your career, some would argue you're a thorn in the side, others would argue you're a model of what parties should be doing. You're currently running against a GOP challenger or a GOP incumbent who they got rid of primaries to block you. You ran as the VP on the Libertarian ticket, and I followed you on Boston 25 recently, and I was struck by what you said to Kerry Kavanaugh. You said, and this was right after Iowa, you said, I think they were trying to stop Sanders. That's why they split the winning ticket in three parts, they, of course, being the Democrats. I don't think the establishment of the Democratic Party wants Senator Sanders. They certainly don't. They certainly didn't last time. She asked you if this was a conspiracy, and you said, yeah, I think so. And I thought that was incredibly telling. So my question is, what do you think the current function of political parties is, and what should it be?
Well, the founders, Washington and Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, were very suspicious of political parties. They called it by the name of faction, and they thought faction was a very bad thing because it would mean that people would have set positions they were going to take irrespective of the merits, and they were right. So they did not foresee the development of political parties, but they began very early by the revolution or the election of 1800. They were well established, and you think the parties these days are shooting at each other. You should see some of the pamphlets the broadsheets that used to be publicized in the days of Hamilton and Jefferson and John Adams. They would regularly accuse the other candidate of having venereal disease, and it went on from there. In the modern era in the United States, when I worked for Senator Jack Javits of New York when I was 22 years old. It was in the late 60s. And, I like to say that was a time when lions still strode the earth in the U.S. Senate. And if someone was giving a speech in the Senate, the galleries, so the Senate has these huge galleries above the Senate chamber, would be absolutely filled with people who wanted to hear the speech and see whether they were going to be persuaded. That was a model of bipartisan legislation, and people gave and people took, and there was some play in the joints. And in the words of Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, who was a Republican who was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, politics stops at the water's edge. So we had a unified approach to foreign policy, and we were able to, advance a coherent view of the world, and America was the envy of the world and the undisputed leader of the free world. That situation is somewhat under attack today, I think, because of what's happened in recent years. And again, I'm not parking this hearse at the president's door at all. This is just something that happened over a period of years. And in my opinion, it began with the election of 1994 when the Republicans took over in Washington and Newt Gingrich became Speaker of the House. I was a big pal of Newt's, and I used to go down and see him in the years leading up to that. I was then a newly elected governor, so I had a certain amount of clout in Washington. Everyone was happy to see me. So I would go to see Newt and sit behind the saloon door, the swinging door, which was the door to his office. They wouldn't even let him, the Democrats wouldn't even let Newt have a door on his office so he could have meetings where he could speak in confidence. And I have every reason to believe that when Newt became Speaker the next year, he didn't forget that. And it went on from there. It just got worse and worse. And hyper gerrymandering drove the Democrats to the left and the Republicans to the right, and just a whole bunch of factors led the spat between the parties to get more and more acrimonious, to the point where today, and this is getting at what I think the current situation is, and again, I said this to the students earlier, but it strikes me that the relationship between the two big parties, the R party and the D party, in Washington now is a death spiral embrace. And the reason it's an embrace is because the two parties need to demonize each other to scare their own base into giving them enough money so that they can get reelected, which is what they're obsessed with at the end of the day, as opposed to legislating for the benefit of all the people of the United States of America. Then as soon as they've gotten reelected, they come back, it's all hunky-dory, and they say, well, let's make a compromise on the budget. And the Democrats wanted social spending to go up 5%, and the Republicans wanted military to go up 5%. So they agreed to compromise by raising everything 15% in the budget. This is exactly what happens in Washington. Year after year, translation, the two big parties in Washington, as opposed to at the state level, in Washington have ceased to perform a valid function as political parties. In the states, it's not true. Look at what goes on between Governor Baker and the legislature, their love notes, their celebrations, and it's better for everybody, and the people's business gets done. But so the function of the parties should be to channel constructive thinking, and there are arguments to be made for being economically conservative, which is what I am. I delighted when the defenders of the president say that I'm a Republican in name only, because I get to come back by saying, no, the president is the Republican in name only, because he's not an economic conservative, at which point the conversation ends. But it is the fact that when I was in office, I was ranked by the numbers the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States. And that's coming right after Mike Dukakis in Massachusetts, which until I got there was called Taxachusetts. So suffice it to say, I think the parties have cut loose from their moorings, and I think some shifts are coming. And I think it probably is going to be a shift in the shape and size of the Republican Party. I think the Republicans are not going to retain control of the Senate, so there may be a certain amount of finger pointing and rearranging of chairs if that happens. And I can possibly see that a combination of centrist, meaning not very liberal Democrats, and large elements of the Republican Party other than the Trump faction, and segments of the Libertarian Party, maybe other sources, could form another party. That could be a number 2 party or a number 3 party. But I think that's coming in the next 4 to 6 years.
A real realignment, you think that can happen?
Yeah, I do. And I'll just mention that in the 1850s, the Whig Party, which was basically the Republican Party
You are
of its
speaking
day.
my language right now.
Yeah. So, so the Whig Party split in half, and it blew up over the issue of slavery. And the Southern faction, which is analogous to the Trump faction, consisted of, it was founded on violent anti-immigrant fervor, just like the Trump faction. And in that case, it was Catholics coming from Ireland, Germany, and Italy, that the Whigs, the Southern faction, just couldn't stand. And they had violent rallies, and they were much given to conspiracy theories, and they looked very much like the Trump faction of the Republican Party today. I realize it's dominant, so maybe it's insulting to call it a faction, but the Trump part of the Republican Party. And the other half, sort of the nicer people, the Northern faction, which was violently anti-slavery, they went on to nominate Abraham Lincoln for President of the United States and elected him 4 years later. So that was a consequence of the split up of the Whig Party, and I think something like that could happen again.
Well, I want to double down on that a little bit. I mean, I know you met with the college Republicans and college Democrats prior to this. I think it's fair to say that the GOP, the national GOP, which you made that distinction is very important, has hardly been a profile in courage in the Trump era, right? And what mystifies me, I get re-election, but he doesn't fit the ideology, as you pointed out, right? He is not fiscally conservative. He is not into family values. Defamation of institutions, law and order. And because this is a university, I want to turn it back to those students. In this context, what did you say to those college Republicans? Is ideology gone in GOP politics? And how do they win the GOP back? And does the GOP want to be won back? Well,
I think the college Republicans should certainly want the GOP to be won back, because right now everything is aimed right at their head. The trillion-dollar deficit's aimed right at their head. Not doing anything about the world going to pieces if the polar ice cap melts, aimed right at their head. They're going to take the consequences there, not my generation, for sure. So I think all the students have a stake in making sure that Washington gets more rational about lawmaking. And again, I draw a sharp distinction between Washington and the states, where by and large business is getting done in a business-like professional fashion. But I think the stakes could not be higher. And the spirit of the Republican legislators in Washington, D.C. today, I don't know. I'd be inclined to hold a mirror up in front of their mouths and see if it fogs up or not, whether there really is any spirit, whether there really is any breath there, other than doing what the president wants them to do, because if they don't, he's going to run someone against them to their right in the primary, and they're going to lose their seat. That's the only way I can account for the 52 Republican senators voting not to remove the president from office when he was so clearly guilty of a constitutional violation. I remind you that I'm the one who wrote the book about what's the grounds for removal of a president. The two things that the founders were most fearful about when they created the removal clause were foreign interference in our affairs and a president advancing at that point, his or her these days, professional or political or financial interest ahead of the national interest. Both those things happened so clearly in the Let's Smear Joe Biden campaign, withholding crucial military aid from Ukraine, that I can't account for those votes other than that.
Respectfully, I'm going to use a very technical political science term. I think you got screwed coming out of New Hampshire in some ways. You got almost 10% of the vote. And it strikes me in the GOP primary in New Hampshire, that we knew what the outcome was going to be. But still, 1 in 10 GOP voters bothered to show up in the cold and voice some dissent. That said, it's only 10%, and I'm not convinced that the GOP isn't going the way that those voters want. So my question to you is, I mean, you did better than almost Elizabeth Warren. It was right the same, and I said he won the Massachusetts side of this coming out of New Hampshire. What do you make of those numbers, though? To me, is it about you? Is it about there is a real clamoring for some that hasn't been answered in this presidential race amongst the GOP?
Yeah, it's not about me. I'm a very good candidate. I have a ton of executive experience, 2 terms as
I
governor.
meant it in a good way.
No, I understand. I'm just making the point. I have a ton of international experience, much of it in the last 15 years when I've traveled the world on business and consulting on behalf of technology and resource companies around the world, and a lot of Asia, a lot of Africa, a lot of places nobody else has been. Spent a lot of time in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
But does experience matter? I mean, it's reality, right? Reality television.
Well, I think experience does matter. Right now, what we've got is a president who says, I don't need to listen to any national security experts or any international experts because I know more than they do. P.S., I'm not willing to read anything or listen to anyone, but I like having summit conferences every few weeks because it gives me a chance to go back to my acting career in reality TV. Candidly, that's no way to run foreign policy. But in terms of the obstacles that have been put in the path of our campaign, if it was all play, they wouldn't call it work, right? And I had no illusions about that, particularly having run as a libertarian on the ticket 4 years ago. So, I went into this because I actually do think I'm the best candidate in either party, and this will be heresy to many, but I think I could beat the Democrat, whether it's a far lefter or not a far lefter, simply because I'd have the economic conservative card to play, and I'm well known as someone who, well, I tend a little bit to the left on social issues, which wouldn't hurt. I've got a big, fat, juicy heart, which wouldn't hurt. So, I think a lot of Democratic voters would come over.
I want the medical records.
From me, you shall have them. So, I think I'm more than up to the job, and so I don't have any hesitation in putting myself forward. And in terms of, the president doesn't want a contest, so he had the Republican National Committee merged with the Trump organization. So now the Republican State Committee in all 50 states is the Trump organization in that state, came right over from the campaign. So, we've got a state chair in Massachusetts now of the Republican Party who says Bill Weld is just the worst thing that ever happened, yada, yada, yada. He's taking dictation. They're all taking dictation. And it's coming from the same source in every case, Donald Trump or Steve Bannon or Steve Miller, even worse.
Well, and that's where I think getting 1 out of 10 when the deck is that stacked, I think that's a story that didn't get enough play because it means GOP voters who knew the fix was in still bothered to show up, to voice some dissent with where the party is going. And is that the way you read it?
I expected to do a bit better in New Hampshire than 10%, but the media seems to agree with your take on that. And what could happen from here? Well, we got 14 states coming up on Super Tuesday, including Massachusetts and Vermont, both of which are crossover states which permit independents and, in Vermont's case, Democrats to take a Republican primary ballot. And when I was running here, I don't think I ever got more than 50% of the Republican vote in a Republican primary. But what would then happen is the independents would then come in for me 6-1. So we've been focusing on the 24 states that do permit an open primary, crossover voting, as I say, and we're going to do better in those by and large than we would in the closed primary states. What could happen from here? Well, let's say, on Super Tuesday, I'll be pessimistic. Let's say the best I do is 15, 20%, maybe 25% in the Super Tuesday states, and it's only 3 or 4 of the 14 states. That's still the media is going to take and run with that. So, now the Trump coalition is really fracturing. Things can happen fast in national politics, and the unthinkable can become the inevitable in a matter of days and weeks. I've seen it happen with Dick Nixon. I was advised not to take the job, even though I was working as a Republican on the Nixon impeachment, because people said, "Kid, he just took 49 states a year and a half ago. You're going to lose your law license if you go up against this guy." I saw it happen with George Bush 41, who was 91% favorable rating, both parties, in December of 1991. going into the election year. So in early February, Pat Buchanan, a very able, very conservative TV commentator with no experience in government whatsoever as an office holder, runs against him in the primary and gets 37% in New Hampshire. It was the beginning of the end for George Bush. Not that anyone thought Pat Buchanan was going to be president of the United States, but that this was just so unsettling. Next thing you know, Ross Perot gets into the race. Next thing you know, George Bush 41, who was a great, uncontroversial president, gets defeated. So things can move fast in Washington, D.C. on the political front.
Indeed. I see a number of my students here. This is a little bit different. I'm teaching women in politics this semester. It's a class I teach fairly regularly.
I mentioned to your students that in my second term, my cabinet consisted of 8 women and 3 men. Charlie Baker was the only white male in the cabinet. He used to look over his shoulder every once in a while. I said, Charlie, that's okay. You're all good.
Excellent. But I'm interested in, and I do know that record, that you've been a model in this regard. That said, the GOP is tanking with women. In impeachment, 59% of women were in favor of impeachment, a 12-point gender gap. Similarly, in the 2018 midterms, another 12-point gap. Another 59% of women were voting for Democrats. And just as importantly, like we're having Jennifer, a Republican who ran in the city council, is coming to class because she's a friend. The GOP in the House went from 23 to 13, and Democrats had 25 more women elected, up to 89. Why is the GOP so comparatively unpopular amongst women and bad at electing them?
Well, they should be unpopular with women. The recent statutes that were passed in the South and in the Midwest regarding reproductive rights were a complete disgrace. And they're giving superior rights to a sexual assaulter than to women, and saying that we want a bunch of male congressmen who live 2,200 miles away to make a decision for you, the woman, as to whether or not you're going to have a child, which is only the most important decision you're ever going to have to make. I think all women, and I'm trying to, recreate the Rainbow Coalition that elected me and Paul Cellucci back in 1990. We had very few establishment backers. We had gays and lesbians, we had people of color. It really was a Rainbow Coalition, and I'm trying to do something like that in this race and get a bunch of outsiders, if you will. But the main 2 groups to which I'm appealing in this race are women, and I don't mean just moderate suburban women. I mean all women who should not be voting for the GOP as it's presently constituted in Washington, and younger voters, the millennials and the Gen Xers. If I could, I would have mobile voting so people could vote using their cell phone. They're already as secure. They recognize iris recognition, and most all smartphones will recognize a thumbprint or a fingerprint. So there's really no security issue there. And last time, 49% of millennials voted, 51% sat on their hands. You take that to 65%, Donald Trump wouldn't win one state against me. So, that may be a vision of the future.
How do you get the party then? The party has been working very hard, voter ID, shortening early voting. There's 2 strategies when you start to lose at the ballot box. You can either expand your base, which is exactly what you're talking about, or you can keep the other people, keep them from the polls. It seems nationally the GOP has gone that way. I mean, you're going up against a huge tide.
No, I get that, but I'm here to call out the National Party for engaging in voter suppression, which they're quite clearly, I haven't been a lawyer in those cases, but my strong sense is that the National Party is trying to suppress voting in areas with a substantial minority population, whether it's in the South or elsewhere, but the most extreme examples, and they've gotten caught in a couple of these cases, and judges have agreed with the plaintiffs. Yeah, and in fact, one GOP candidate had to say, yeah, this is no good, and they reran the race. And that's coming straight out of Washington, D.C., and it's coming straight out of the president and his political advisors, led by Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, and they're just not people who should be in charge of the United States. The president has said if Donald Trump, doesn't win re-election in November 2020, there's going to be a civil war in this country. Well, talk about waving the bloody shirt. And you may say, oh, that's just a figure of speech, it's just extravagant. I know of a number of people in Massachusetts, young men, who've said, Civil War, sounds good to me, bring it on. We've got our guns. And this is not in Montana or Idaho, this is in Massachusetts. So those are words that should not be flung about by a president of the United States. Similarly, Steve Bannon, the Breitbart News guy, who's the president's chief of Svengali and Robespierre, says that if the president is reelected, you're going to have 4 years of unrequited payback. That's not much of a choice, is it?
Do you think the president's, well, you said at the beginning that you used a hearse metaphor. A lot of people think the president's the problem, right? This is in part, the Joe Biden line, right? The president is the problem. Once the president's gone, we return to normal time politics. But you were referencing 1994 and the Republican Revolution, gerrymandering. I teach political science here, and it's not easy to say to students you should invest in these institutions. I mean, of course that's what they say, but our politics have been on a downward slope for a while. My personal view is, yes, he put gasoline on that, but the train was coming. How do you, when we think about, and obviously you're doing it, you're specifically taking action to try to reverse this. What do you tell other students, other people? What do they need to do day to day when this seems inevitable? This seems very hard to fight against.
Well, in one respect, I'm kind of an optimist on this. First of all, I agree with Joe Biden. I think the president is the problem. The Trump voters are not the problem. I go up to the Trump people standing at the polling places, and I talk to them and their state representatives, Republicans from New Hampshire or wherever. I talked to a crowd of 500 Trump supporters in Iowa at the caucuses, and they gave me more than polite applause. I didn't trash the president quite as much as my fellow Republican Joe Walsh, who was still in the race at that point, did, and he was jeered off the stage. But it's a choice of words. No, I talked to a lot of Trump voters, and with the exception of just a couple of people in the late afternoon, at a seaside rally, haven't really encountered anybody who wasn't completely civil. And I go in diners and parts of New Hampshire, there would be 3 Trump voters and 97 not Trump voters in Hanover, the college towns. But they would say, well, really, why are you doing this? And da-da-da-da-da. It's not the Trump voters. And a lot of the ones who got in because they felt bad and the president's dog whistles were reaching their ears, like you're being preyed upon by these people who crawled through the mud across the Mexican border. I think that's a hard thing to make stick, but when you've just lost your job and your spouse is saying, where's the money to put food on the table, you might want to pick up that narrative, and that dog whistle might sound pretty good. And I'm not wagging a finger at those folks. So I think if the president had been removed by the Senate, which was their duty and they defaulted on, or if the president is removed by simply losing the 2040 election, I think when that day comes, it's going to be like, whew, did that really happen, or was that a bad dream? Because I can tell you, I travel all over the country. The one thing that unifies people all over this country is they are exhausted. And they're exhausted by the Trump phenomenon and the fact that they have to pay attention to Mr. Trump for 6 hours every day. They don't even want to pronounce his name. They say, can't you get that guy out of there? Can't you do something about this? And this is Trump. It's not the fact that, more than half the people, actually that's not true, almost half the people voted for him. But he did win the election with a little help from abroad, but I don't think that was decisive.
I'm going to push back, and then I will get to questions after this, though. But, what if he wins? I mean, we've been surprised before. This is, I want specific messages. What do we tell citizens that they need to be doing? Because, I'm from Ohio. I know the Trump voters, right? We don't disparage the voter. But what do we do to say, institutions do matter to part of what you're talking about? That, the Senate had a duty and the Senate didn't do it, and you should be angry. If we've disparaged government for 40 or 50 years, we're treading in water where government is perceived as the enemy. How do we change that and get people to want to be civically engaged in ways that aren't the combative that you've alluded to?
Well, as early as 1980, the Republican Party was saying, and I think I might have been part of this bandwagon, railing against big government and saying government is not the end to all our problems. Government can be a problem itself as well as the solution. I remember that being said at the convention that nominated Ronald Reagan in 1980. So that issue was still out there, but there wasn't the bitterness that there is today. So the reason I call myself an optimist is because I'm holding up a picture of the future where we don't have this terrible acrimony. And I do think if Mr. Trump were removed from the situation, that would go away. I think if Mitch McConnell had his choice between having the Senate kept in Republican hands and the president losing, or having the president win and losing the Republican majority in the Senate, it wouldn't even be close. His duty is to the Senate. And a great number of Republican senators whom I know have no taste for the president whatsoever. And, I've worked with many of those people for decades. So I know them well enough to speak to them frankly. And they said...
Name names.
Excuse me?
Name names.
Yeah. Well, a number of them...
I won't tell anyone.
A number of them self-confessed to the press, not off the record, but on background, and the press printed this, that, we talked to X number of senators, Republicans, about their vote, and they said the only reason I voted not to convict was fear that the president would run someone against me to my right, and I would lose my seat. And by the way, if hypothetically that should ever be true of me, and it never would be, but if it were, I wouldn't admit that on background or off the record or to my own spouse. It's a hideous admission.
Yeah, the re-election calculus. I want to make sure there's nothing worse than when we talk the whole time and you guys don't get a chance to ask some questions. There are mics on both sides. What I'd like to do is take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then the governor can respond. I see a student from the Women in Politics class going up. I will definitely favor my people. Go ahead up. But some other questions as well, and then maybe you could get a chance to respond to a couple.
It's okay. Hi, Governor Weld. I'm a writer for the school newspaper, and as Professor O'Brien mentioned, I'm in the Women in Politics class. So, I was just wondering. So you did run on the Libertarian ticket as the VP, and you have a lot of libertarian tendencies, I'd say. My question is twofold. First, do you have any? So you talked earlier that you would do a state of emergency as president. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how to decrease federal power in terms of the executive office and sort of offload that power to Congress and the House of Representatives. And my second question is, do you have any knowledge or thoughts on how to decrease the duopoly of, because you mentioned you get bad things from Republicans and you get negative stuff from Democrats. Is there any way that you could think that to decrease the duopoly and sort of help third-party candidates or maybe even independents like Bernie Sanders win big elections? Thank you.
Anybody else want to go up so we can get 1 or 2? Because we'll definitely, let's take this and then you can respond in kind.
Governor Weld, thank you for coming today. I just wanted to ask, relating to the way politics have been, it's been a very divisive past 4 years as far as I can remember personally. There are 2 questions from me. Would you support a nationwide system, or at least an implementation of ranked choice of voting, so that people could say, list, I like this person and that person and so on, that kind of thing, so that we could, that gives the chance for independent candidates to run in any office, like president, governor, or otherwise. And also, that's the only question. I can't forget the other.
That's a lot to chew on. We've got federal, state power, we've got the 2-party system, and we've got ranked choice.
So I'm strongly in favor of ranked choice voting, as you would expect from any libertarian, because it means that intensity of support gets entered into the equation. So I think that would help third parties, and I think that's a good thing. On the question of presidential power, yeah, I would sit down with Congress and say, let's erect some guardrails here so that things like what President Trump has been doing, just totally going off on his own toot, would not be possible. And you know, the low point of President Obama's tenure was probably when he backtracked on the red line with Syria. Everyone hated that. But the reason he did that was his counsel persuaded him that he was, you know, beyond the guardrail. And she was, you know, one person and persuaded the president. So he took all this enormous heat. I still think it was a grievous error, but he did it for the right reason. And I think we've gone way too far in the direction of the imperial presidency and in the hands of someone like Donald Trump, who's shown many indications of wanting to take over our and crush our democratic institutions, so there'd be no bar to his doing everything that he wants to do or that strikes his fancy. You know, he says a free press is the enemy of the people, an independent judiciary is a danger to the people. That's a would-be dictator talking. So for that, among many other reasons, I would sit down and talk with Congress specifically about what guardrails are appropriate. And Congress has been complicit here. They've been happy to yield that power since the days of Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson was the fellow, and it might have been true of FDR also, to be frank, but Lyndon Johnson was the person whose administration would write speeches for members of Congress so that they could know every word that would be said by this congressman. And the congressman was very happy to have a speech that would play to great reviews given to him without his staff having to do it. Back on the duopoly question, Gary Johnson and I actually ran in 2016 against the duopoly. And Gary was governor of New Mexico when I was governor of Massachusetts. We were pretty good friends. We were two of the very few governors who would go to governors' meetings and didn't like to hear ourselves talk for the sake of hearing our own voice. So we became good friends, and it was a terrific fun to run with Gary. But he used to say, and I believed it too, that we had, in this election of 2016, the last one, we had a 6-lane highway up the middle because we were fiscally conservative and socially welcoming, tolerant, open, even liberal, whatever adjective you want to use. And neither of the other parties was, because the Democrats were clearly not fiscally conservative, and the Republicans were clearly not socially welcoming, open, and tolerant. And we thought we had a great shot. And we wound up with less than 5% of the vote. 4.5 million votes sounds like a lot, and it is a lot for a third party. And it was 3 times the best previous showing by the Libertarian Party. But if we'd gotten to 5%, it would have given that party majority party status, meaning it would have been on the ballot in all 50 states without having to spend the entire 3 years, 2 years getting on the ballots, and that's a lot of work. So what that proved to me was that we need to do the same thing that mommy and daddy did. The feeling in people's heads was too strong. And, you know, I remember the definition of a political party in a book written by a guy called Clinton Rossiter. It's called The American Presidency. And he says, a political party in this country is a vast, gaudy, friendly umbrella that can be loved and trusted and recognized at succeeding elections as being the same thing that was loved and trusted before. It's a great definition of a political party, but it's not panning out all that well
It's not in the American politics textbook, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Let's go over here, these two. Let's take both your questions so the governor can respond.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep. All right. Awesome. So I have a bit of a long statement, so nobody fall asleep on me.
If it's that long, I'll cut you off. So
right.
Ask a question.
Hi, Mr. Weld. I'm a student from Suffolk University who had a class with Professor Dr. Lawrence Overland, who lectures for the Political Science and Legal Studies Department. In his class, he had mentioned that he had met you a long time ago, and since then, he brought up in one of his classes that you had brought up a controversial statement you said in the 1990s, one you probably don't hear the end of for good reasons. Let's reintroduce Massachusetts prisoners to the joys of busting rocks. While you plan to eliminate televisions in state prisons, I wanted to ask you how your opinion has changed on this since you've been historically tough on crime, marked by your participation in the war of drugs under Reagan, while Well, also I want to ask, what is your platform on topics including criminal justice reform, mandatory minimums, and recidivism? What are you going to do about these problems? Thank you.
So thank you. Let's get one more, and then I'll give you the chance to respond. Thank you.
Hi, Governor. Two questions. The first one is that there are enormous forces out there that keep some candidates down and let others rise to the top. I can think of media being one. It doesn't seem like the media has anointed you, unfortunately. But there's social media. There's big money in politics. It doesn't appear that you have Bloomberg money or Tom Steyer money. You have some money. But I'm wondering what you can do to get your voice heard more, considering these enormous forces out there that I think probably are not lifting you up. And the second question is, if you had to choose a Democratic vice president, who would you choose? Thank you.
So on the forces, the dark forces that keep good people down and lift up less good people, the short answer is I think the Citizens United case in the U.S. Supreme Court, which allowed unlimited amounts of money to be devoted to be donated to political campaigns, including anonymously, and unlimited amounts by both corporations and labor unions. It's got to be overturned, and the justices put it upon constitutional grounds, so it's going to take a constitutional convention to overturn it. And probably the only way to do that is by doing it under Article 5 of our Constitution, which is an independent basis for changing the Constitution, as opposed to trying to get ratification by 3/4 of the states. But I'd try one or both ways to get rid of Citizens United, because I think it has had a major impact on our politics in the United States. And that tax bill, it's actually Paul Ryan's tax bill that was passed in 2017, not Mr. Trump's. All he added was the provisions, the pushback provisions, anyway, getting at New York and California and Massachusetts, the coastal states that didn't vote for him. He put in the provision that said state and local taxes shall no longer be deductible, and that was just aimed at those states. But that's all he did. So he was not, didn't have much to do with that tax bill otherwise. But I think that's the short answer to what to do about the dark forces. And the fact that the tax bill was so tilted in favor of the ultra rich, the super rich, not just the 1%ers. I think there's some very nice people in this room who are probably 1%ers.
False.
Well, no, I can think of one.
No, the one, oh, really? Introduce me.
So that's my answer to that one. On the criminal justice reform, I was actually part of my job description when I was head of the criminal division in Washington to be liaison to the U.S. Sentencing Commission, which had just been created, and part of the charge for them was to tighten up sentencing, and the administration of which I was a part was in favor of mandatory minimums. And it is true that when I ran in 1990, I pointed out that the sentences in Massachusetts were probably not tough enough, because a lot of times a judge would sentence someone to 20 years in Concord, Concord being the old reform school in Concord, Mass. But everybody in the courtroom, except for the victim of the offense, knew that what that really meant was that person was going to be out in 6 months. And that was not a good thing. So I favored truth in sentencing, and that morphed in Washington into mandatory minimum sentencing. And I had a battle royal with judges all over the country who thought correctly that that was limiting their power by removing their discretion at sentencing. So that was in my job description at the time. But I was tough. As a candidate, my first race, which I lost by a margin of 4-1, was tough on taxes, tough on crime. And I did have a self-image of being tough on crime. And we were although I will say that my number one priority as a prosecutor, when I could call the shots, was public corruption, which nobody else made their number one priority. And probably what got me elected governor was we filed, when I was U.S. attorney, you had total discretion, 111 public corruption cases, and we got convictions either by jury or guilty plea in 110 out of 111. So that went the other way. That was emphasizing white-collar offenses rather than street crimes. Now, fast forward, I'm very much in favor of criminal justice reform provisions at the current time. I publicly endorsed Senator Cory Booker's bill, which would take 79,000, I think it was 79, might have been 17,000 prisoners out of federal prison who were basically sentenced for possessory marijuana offenses. You know, a year and a half ago, I went on the board of a marijuana company because I'd become convinced, at the time it was medicinal, but now it's full adult rec as well. But I became convinced reading all the research that's been done in Israel and other countries that at least CBD, which is one of the ingredients in cannabis, it's the non-psychotropic one, can be very useful for treating a wide array of any diseases involving the nervous system, and has a calming effect. And you know, people now are buying it and using it for back pain, et cetera, et cetera. And there were people languishing in federal prison who were sentenced 10 years ago to prison for, you know, having 6 ounces of marijuana. It's right back to reefer madness in the 1930s. So I totally have changed my position there, and I think there's still some work to be done. We had the First Step statute that was passed with the president's support. Good for him. And we need now to go on to bail reform and other provisions which will humanize our criminal justice system. The other thing after the shooting... You're
going to go quick, and you're going to give our VP, because I want to give these
after
two
the
people
shooting
the
in
last.
Ferguson, Missouri, and a lot of other similar shootings, I think we have to take steps to pull back from the militarization of the police. Right now, there's the policies set the police and the citizenry almost as you know, town gown against each other, and that's a bad thing.
And your Democratic VP pick?
Oh, there's so many to choose from.
Fewer every day.
I really don't know. You know, I think it would be so presumptuous of me to, you know, I'm at, what, 3, 6, 9% in the polls, and I'm announcing my VP pick. I'm not so sure about that. I'll tell you who I enjoy talking to on the trail is Pete Buttigieg. He's got a lot to say, and he's very open. I liked him. I liked Andrew Yang a lot. Of course, Andrew Yang is a Republican, not a Democrat, but that's okay.
All right, these will be the last 2 questions, so if you could just give the question quickly, and then we'll take it from there, or you'll take it from there.
I'm retired. I'm available 2 hours a day, 6 days a week. How can I help, and who should I contact?
I'm going to answer that one before he forgets. Weld2020.org. WELD2020.org.
Superb. Kiki.
Welcome, Governor Weld. 2 quick questions. One, how would your immigration policy differ from President Trump's? And 2, why do you think, or do you think, that the Republican Party is whitening, has a diversity problem? And what would you do about it? Thanks.
Well, about the diversity problem, I would do what I did in Massachusetts, which is to appoint commissions of persons of color, you know, African American, Caribbean American, Hispanic American, East Asian, South Asian, Muslim. So I did, and met monthly with them to bring them into the administration. Do you have candidates for judgeships? Do you have candidates for cabinet members? Candidates for boards and commissions? And it was like scales falling from their eyes. No one had ever said anything like this to them before, and their mouths were just open. So that was one thing that I did. But, you know, the best speech I ever gave in my life was in the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill the Saturday before the election in 1990. Everybody was either black or Hispanic or gays and lesbians, and I said I was elected by a rainbow coalition, and I was. The first time. I think I was elected the first time as a liberal and the second time as a conservative, but who knew? Anyway, one of my ancestors was Theodore Dwight Weld, and my family was very active in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War and getting escaped slaves to the north. And this fellow was a number 2 to William Lloyd Garrison. So I said Theodore Dwight Weld was my ancestor, and by the way, Garrison was a famous abolitionist. I said, by the way, when it comes to prejudice against gays and lesbians, I will be an abolitionist. When it comes to making people live in the shadows, I will be an abolitionist. When it comes to having second-class citizens, I will be an abolitionist. And I was. And so that's what I would do about trying to bring everybody in, unleash everybody's energy, make everybody feel good about being an American, instead of taking the opposite tack, which I do think Mr. Trump does take. He wants to set group against group. He wants people to feel bad about themselves. He wants them to feel that their problems are somebody else's fault. It's disgraceful.
Thank you. I know I speak for everyone here when I have a lot of genuine respect for you. We need public servants that you can have reasoned disagreement with. And thank you for choosing to come to UMass Boston. It means a lot, and get others here, okay?
Thank you for having me. Thank you.